This is Japan, a country that has experienced one of the greatest economic miracles of all time. At its peak, Japan rapidly became the second largest economy in the world and was poised to overtake the United States as the global economic powerhouse. Consider this. In a short span of 15 years, Japan's economy grew over 400%, per capita GDP grew 350%, and it earned consistent double-digit growth for almost a decade, an achievement that was unheard of at the time. And what makes this achievement so remarkable is that it had very few advantages to begin with. Japan is a country with no natural resources, lots of natural disasters, and before it got rich, it was a country with rampant poverty devastated by the Second World War. So, what happened? How did this tiny country with zero natural resources and lots of natural disasters manage to become so rich? And what are several underlying factors that make Japan an economic superpower? To answer those questions, we need to start from the very beginning. After World War II, Japan was truly devastated. It lost 1.8 to 2.8 million people, it lost 25% of its national wealth, and industrial production was down 90% from the pre-war period. 4 million civilians working in military-related jobs found themselves out of work, and 5 to 6 million soldiers coming home created a huge wave of unemployment. Bombing severely damaged city infrastructures that created a housing crisis. Inflation reached 295%, and the country had severe shortages of food and energy, two of the most important commodities for a human life. So, to know how Japan got so rich in the first place, we need to understand how Japan managed to rebuild its economy. Right away after the end of World War II, the Allied forces led by the US sent General Douglas MacArthur to rebuild Japan. The occupation of Japan can be divided into two phases. The first phase, from September 1945 to 1947, involved fundamental changes in Japanese society, like downgrading the emperor's status to that of a figurehead without political control, and punishing military leaders for their crimes during the war. On the economic front, one big change in Japan was the breakup of the Zaibatsu, which is a group of large families of business conglomerates that held monopoly power over a significant part of the Japanese economy, with the most powerful families being the Mitsui, Sumitomo, Mitsubishi, and Yasuda families. This was done in an effort to eliminate the concentration of economic power. Another important reform includes the implementation of American-style free market system, with the antitrust laws, labor union laws, and securities exchange laws as the most important ones. And it also initiated land reforms that benefited tenant farmers and reduced the power of rich landowners, many of whom advocated Japan to enter the war and expand its territory in the 1930s. All of these policies served as a foundation of Japan's economic miracle many years later. Meanwhile, the second phase of the Japanese occupation was all about reviving the Japanese economy. By late 1947, the economic crisis in Japan was too large to ignore, and the Allied forces were concerned over the spreading of communism, especially in Asia. So, to rapidly rebuild an economy despite shortages in resources, it implemented a priority production strategy. A strategy that concentrates valuable resources in some of the most important sectors, such as mining, electricity, steel, railway transportation, etc. By 1949, industrial production recovered to 80% of the pre-war period. To control the massive inflation, American banker and chairman of Detroit Bank Joseph Dodge, an economic advisor for the Allied forces, implemented the Dodge Line, with an emphasis of balancing the national budget and implementing a fixed exchange rate of 360 yen to $1 to keep Japanese export prices low. It achieved its goal, but not without plunging Japan into a deep recession in 1949. Japan's much-needed rapid recovery was created by an unexpected situation, which was the Korean War that started in 1950. Due to its proximity to Korea, Japan became the US's main base of operations and the main supplier of US government, which provided Japan with stimulus amounting to $2 billion from 1950 to 1953. Domestically, an expansion of business investments in the early 1950s brought new technologies such as strip mills in steel making, electric welding in shipbuilding, and many other technologies in heavy industry that increased productivity. The Japanese government also implemented policies that promoted business development, with the most important policy being the creation of Japan Development Bank, which supplied the private industry with long-term and low-cost capital. Now, this was all easier said than done, as during the post-war recovery, the biggest challenge for Japan's economy was the shortage of capital for investment, which was created by a shortage of savings. In the early 1950s, the household savings rate was around 10%, which is pretty low by international standards. This heightens the risk of Japan for entering a savings shortage trap, which is a problem that many developing countries have. It is when a shortage of savings led to a shortage of capital for investment, leading to a low production capacity, stagnant income, and finally depressing the savings rate even more. As a result, Japan's economy relied much more on financial institutions such as banks to fund business investments, as opposed to the US, which relied more on its capital markets. For example, the Bank of Japan provided loans to businesses using financial institutions with a monetary technique known as window guidance, where the Bank of Japan simply tells private banks to create credits to specific key sectors that they want to develop. In addition, commercial banks borrowed money from the central bank and actively lent it to businesses. And businesses borrowed heavily from banks, resulting in low capital ratios. This is known as overlending and overborrowing. Now, this type of monetary expansion has a huge risk of causing rapid inflation, but in Japan, inflation was kept pretty low. This happens because businesses use their long-term loans for real business investments that increase production capacity and workers' productivity, not for speculation or malinvestment. Another problem was that Japan's overlending strategy heightened the risk of bankruptcy, but the government protected the banking sector from bankruptcy, and banks that faced financial problems were merged with healthier banks. This is how from the 1950s to the early 1990s, no major bankruptcies occurred in the banking sector. With the system in place, Japan eventually entered its miraculous growth years. Between 1955 and 1972, Japan's real GDP grew by 9.3% annually. And in the fall of 1960, Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda proposed the income doubling plan, intending to double the size of Japan's economy in 10 years. Despite being criticized as too ambitious, Japan exceeded expectations when the economy doubled in size in less than 7 years, making the plan a complete success. During the miracle decade of the 1960s, a positive feedback loop kept the economy growing. An increase in demand causes production to expand, which increases income and consumption. As living standards rise, increased savings result in investment growth and an expansion in production capacity, and the virtuous cycle continues. Due to rapid growth and the emergence of new products, the expansion of production capacity was always lagging behind that of demand. Household consumption started to drive the economy as consumer items spread into households. There's a well-known 1960s saying in Japan that a family couldn't function if it didn't have the three treasures: a refrigerator, a washing machine, and a television set. In 1962, 79.4% of families living in urban areas owned a television. On the supply side, the import of foreign technology, a young population, an increase in the household savings rate, and high educational attainment contributed to Japan's rapid growth. Particularly, technology is where Japan shines the most and was a huge part of its economic miracle. The fact that Japan was in the process of catching up to other industrialized nations such as the US and European countries created a latecomer advantage, where Japan could learn foreign technologies and examine the mistakes that other industrialized nations made. Japanese technicians and workers also had the skills and knowledge needed not only to utilize new technologies, but also to improve them. This was of course enabled by its high-level education system. In investigations by the IEA, Japanese students have ranked among the highest in mathematics and science. In the mid-1960s, Japan encountered a problem. As wages went up and living standards rose, labor-intensive manufacturing products like textiles lost their price competitiveness. But fortunately, capital-intensive and technology-intensive products don't encounter the same problem, as wage increases can be offset by higher productivity gains. And thanks to the 360 yen to $1 fixed exchange rate, which many economies consider undervalued, their prices actually declined in foreign countries, allowing Japan to gain significant market share in export markets like the US and Europe. as their products were cheaper and arguably better than competitors. As a result, industries like coal and textiles became extinct, while companies in the electronics and automobile industries shined. Companies such as Toyota, Honda, Sony, and Mitsubishi are all well-known companies contributing to Japanese export growth. Toyota, for example, first entered the US market in 1957 and the European market in 1963. It sold its 1 millionth car in 1972 globally, and in 1985 it sold 1 million cars in the US alone. Even today, it is still the single biggest company in Japan and the largest car company in the world based on revenue. Now, economic growth is one thing, but how does this rapid growth affect people's livelihood? Well, a surge of consumer goods like refrigerators and televisions caused changes in people's lives, and a sense of middle class was shared by most Japanese people. Economic infrastructures were also actively developed. Japan is famous for its high-speed bullet train, and it was first developed during the rapid growth period in 1964, the opening of the Tokaido Shinkansen connecting Tokyo and Osaka. Increased income, quality of life, and medical care also lengthened people's lifespan. The average lifespan for Japanese in 1950 was around 60, and 20 years later in 1970, it improved to 72. Higher education also became more available for ordinary people. Only 10% of students entered college in 1960, which increased to 40% in 1975. And during this period, income gap narrowed, meaning that growth was enjoyed by both the rich and poor alike. But economic growth also had its dark side, mainly because of environmental degradation and severe pollution in large cities. Air and water pollution were a major problem in Japan at the time, with several large cases such as the Minamata disease with casualties of up to 2,000 people. In the early 1970s, Japan implemented regulations to control pollution, and right now, the pollution problem is mostly gone. It is important to note that Japan's rapid growth of 10% per year ended in 1973, caused by the oil crisis as members of OPEC started an oil embargo. But Japan's economy had matured enough, as it became the second largest economy in 1968, only behind the US. And as growth faltered, structural weaknesses began to emerge in the Japanese economy, although they were still very rich then. You may know what happens next: the massive bubble economy in the 1980s and its subsequent burst in the 1990s, leading to 30 years of economic stagnation. But that's a story for another time, and I'm going to make a video about that soon. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.